You ever watch a grown man fail at the same thing 12 times and still walk back to the line like it owes him something? I have. I watched it for 2 days straight, and I'm telling you the 13th time was the worst because by then nobody was cheering anymore. Nobody was even talking, just the wind. Just that long, dry whistle coming off the flats and the sound of a man's boots crunching back to the firing position like he was walking to his own funeral. I'll start from the beginning, because if I don't, you won't understand why the man who finally did it, the quiet one, the SEAL, why he didn't say a single word the whole time. Not before, not after, and why, when it was over, half of us couldn't even look at him. Let me set it up for you. This was out in the high desert. I won't tell you exactly where, because honestly it doesn't matter, and some of the people there would rather I keep it vague. But picture it. Way out past anything. The kind of place where the road just stops being a road and becomes a suggestion. We'd driven 4 hours from the nearest town, and the last 40 minutes of that was nothing but dust and scrub and these big flat brown stretches that went on forever. It was late summer, the kind of heat that doesn't feel like heat anymore. It just feels like the air is mad at you. By 9 in the morning, the ground was already shimmering. You'd look out at the target line and the whole world would ripple like you were staring at it through water. That mirage, by the way, is the thing that breaks shooters. I learned that later, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So there were maybe 30 of us out there. Some military, some private contractors, a couple of ballistics nerds with laptops and tripods, and these little weather stations on poles. There was a guy from a rifle company. There were 2 old retired guys who I think were there just to watch, sitting in folding camp chairs under a pop-up tent, sipping coffee out of dented thermoses like they'd seen it all and were waiting to see it again. And there was the target. 4,000 meters out, 4 kilometers, 2.5 miles, give or take. I need you to actually sit with that for a second, because the number doesn't mean anything until you try to look at it. They'd set up a steel plate, painted white, about the size of a kitchen table, and from the firing line you could not see it, not with your eyes. You could see roughly where it was, a faint pale smudge against the brown, but only if someone pointed and you squinted and let your eyes settle. It was so far away that the curve of the earth was actually part of the math. So far that when somebody fired, the sound of the hit, if it ever came, would arrive something like 11, 12 seconds after the trigger. 11 seconds. You'd shoot and then you'd wait, and wait, long enough to forget you'd even fired. And then, if you were lucky, which nobody was, tonk. This faint little ringing of metal carried back on the wind like a bell from another country. The old guy next to me, one of the camp chair guys, he leaned over the first morning and said, "Son, a bullet at that range isn't a bullet anymore. It's a prayer with a copper jacket." I laughed he didn't. Here's the thing about a shot like that. I didn't understand it at first, but the ballistics guys broke it down for me while we waited, and once I got it, I couldn't stop thinking about it. At 4,000 meters, the bullet is in the air for the better part of 9, 10 seconds. Think about everything that can happen in 10 seconds. The wind out there wasn't one wind, it was 3 or 4 winds, stacked at different heights, all going different directions, all changing minute to minute. There'd be a breeze at the line, a crosswind halfway out, and then dead air near the target, and a shooter had to read all of it at once and basically guess where the wind would be by the time the bullet got out there. Not where it was, where it would be. And the bullet itself, by the end of that flight, it's barely moving compared to how it started. It's tired. It's tumbling on the edge of going subsonic, wobbling, and the tiniest thing, a degree of temperature, a puff of air, the spin of the earth itself, nudges it feet off course. At that distance, an error you'd never even notice up close turns into a miss by the length of a school bus. So when I tell you they took 13 attempts, I don't mean 13 sloppy tries. I mean 13 of the best long-range shooters that money and reputation could pull into one patch of desert, each of them backed by a spotter, and a computer and instruments that could measure the air down to numbers I didn't understand. 13 real, calculated, dialed-in attempts. And not one of them rang that bell. The first shooter was a younger guy. Cocky, but the good kind of cocky, the kind that's earned. Competition background. He had this way of moving that was all economy, no waste. He got down behind his rifle and he was back there a long time. 20 minutes easy, just reading. His spotter calling numbers low and steady. The little flags they'd planted down the range were twitching, and you could see him watching them, watching the mirage boil, waiting for the air to do the same thing twice so he could trust it. Then he fired. And we all just stopped, the whole crowd, 30 people holding their breath, counting in our heads. 1, 2, 3. Nothing. 4, 5, 6. Still nothing. Somewhere around 9 the spotter said real quiet, "Miss left, wide left." He'd been off by something like 15 meters. 15 meters at that range is actually good. That's the crazy part. That's a phenomenal shot. It just wasn't a hit. He took 2 more. Same story. Closer, but the bell stayed quiet. And then he sat back on his heels, took off his cap, wiped his face with it, and said the only thing anybody said all morning that made everybody laugh. "That plate is personally insulting me." By the afternoon of the first day, 4 shooters had gone, 0 hits. The mood was still light, though. Everybody figured it was just a matter of time. These were serious people. The target was just steel. Steel doesn't fight back. Right. That night we camped. And I remember it got cold fast, the way the desert does, like somebody pulled a plug. We sat around and the talk was all numbers, drop, drift, spin, drift, Coriolis, transonic this and subsonic that. Words I half understood. Somebody had a chart taped to the side of a truck with everybody's attempts marked on it. 4 red X's, no green checks. One of the contractors, big guy beard, had been in the Marines, said something I keep coming back to. He said, "The thing about a shot like this, it's not really about being a great shooter. Plenty of great shooters here. It's about being right about something you can't actually see 11 seconds before it happens. It's about humility. The flats don't care how good you are. They'll humble a legend before lunch." He'd find out he was right about himself the next morning. Day 2, this is when it started getting heavy. Shooters 5 through 9 went through the morning, and I watched something happen to the group that I didn't have a word for at the time. The laughing stopped, not all at once. It just kind of drained out. Each miss landed a little harder than the last. Each guy who walked back from the line did it a little slower. Because now it wasn't a fun challenge. Now it was a wall, and the wall was winning. Shooter 7 was the bearded Marine contractor. And I'll be honest with you, I had money on him in my head, just the way he carried himself. He spent 45 minutes behind that rifle, 45. His spotter ran the numbers 3 different times. When he finally sent it, the silence was so total I could hear my own heartbeat. We counted. And at 12 seconds, 12, almost too long, we'd half given up, there was this sound. Not the bell, a different sound. A dull, flat thud carried back faint on the wind. The spotter jerked up off his scope. "That hit dirt," he said. Right at the base of the plate, 18 inches low." 18 inches. At 4,000 meters. The bullet had traveled 2.5 miles and arrived 1.5 feet below a kitchen table. And here's the thing, nobody cheered, but nobody groaned either. There was this weird, sick respect in the air, because that was the closest anyone had come, and it was still a miss, and somehow that made it worse. It told us the target could be reached. The flats would let a bullet get there. They just wouldn't let it get there right. The Marine sat up, looked at the smudge in the distance for a long minute and said, "Yeah, just that. Yeah," like the desert had told him something private and he was agreeing with it. He didn't take another shot. He'd had 3 attempts in him and he'd spent them. He packed up his gear slow and deliberate and went and sat in one of the camp chairs and didn't say much for the rest of the day. I want to tell you about the SEAL now, even though he didn't shoot until much later, because he was there the whole time, and I didn't notice him at first. That was kind of the whole point of him, I think. you weren't supposed to notice him. He'd come in with one of the quieter groups. No patches, no logos, nothing that said anything about who he was. Just a plain tan shirt gone pale from washing, faded ball cap, beard going gray at the edges of his jaw. Older than most of the guys out there. Mid-40s, maybe more. He had a build like someone who'd been strong his whole life and had stopped caring whether it showed. And he watched. That's all he did for 2 days. He watched every single shooter, but not the way the rest of us watched, leaning in, reacting, wincing at the misses. He watched the range. He'd stand off to the side with his hands in his pockets and his eyes out on the flats, and you'd swear he was reading something the rest of us couldn't see. Every time the flags moved, his head moved just a little. Every time the mirage shifted, you'd catch his eyes track across it. One of the ballistics guys had a little weather meter, and he was always checking it, calling out wind and temp and pressure. And I noticed the SEAL never once looked at that meter. Not one time. He just looked at the air, at the grass, at the way the dust lifted and settled. I asked him a question once, day 2, when he was standing near me, just to be friendly. I said, "You gonna take a crack at it?" He didn't look at me right away. He kept his eyes on the flats, and after a second he just said, "Maybe, if it stops lying." If it stops lying. I didn't know what that meant. I asked him what he meant, and he didn't answer. He just gave this small nod, almost to himself, like he'd seen the wind do something, and walked off toward the trucks. That was the most words I'd hear out of him for a long time. By the end of day 2, the count was up to 11 attempts. 11 shooters, or some of them on second and third tries. I lost exact track. The chart on the truck was a column of red, no green. And the energy out there had changed into something I genuinely never felt before and haven't really felt since. It wasn't defeat exactly. It was closer to reverence. Like we'd all come out to conquer something and slowly, one miss at a time, realized that the thing was bigger than all of us put together. The plate wasn't a target anymore. It had become a kind of presence. We'd glance out at that pale smudge and lower our voices like it might hear us. The retired guy, the camp chair philosopher, he summed it up that second night. The fire was low and most folks were quiet, tired in that bone-deep way that has nothing to do with physical work. And he said to nobody and everybody, "Funny thing about a wall, everybody who hits it thinks they're the one who's gonna go through, then they don't. And the wall doesn't even notice them, it just stands there. Same as it stood for the last guy, same as it'll stand for the next." He took a sip of his coffee. "And then one day," he said, "somebody walks up to it real quiet and doesn't even seem to be trying, and the wall just opens. And you spend the rest of your life wondering what they knew that nobody else did." I thought he was just being poetic, an old man romanticizing. I didn't know yet that I'd watch exactly that happen the next morning. Day 3 started wrong. I felt it before I even got out of my sleeping bag. The wind was up, not strong exactly, but busy. You could hear it before you saw daylight, this restless hiss through the scrub that kept changing pitch. On the first 2 days, the mornings had been calm, glassy, the best window for shooting before the heat got up and started boiling the air. That was the only time anybody had come close. Early, before the sun got mean. But this morning the air never settled. The flags down the range weren't twitching anymore. They were working. All of them at different angles. One flag near the line would lay flat to the left, and the next one a few hundred meters out would be pointing somewhere else entirely. The ballistics guy looked at his little meter, then looked down the range, then looked at his meter again and just kind of laughed without any humor in it. "Switching every 30 seconds, he said. "Good luck reading that." Somebody asked if they should just call it, wait for the wind to lie down. And one of the organizers, there were a couple of guys sort of running the thing, said no. He said this was the point. He said anybody can ring steel on a glass calm morning eventually if you let them shoot all day. The flats on a calm day were just patient. But a day like this was the real test. This was the flats with their teeth out. I remember thinking, that's it then. Nobody's hitting it today. Maybe nobody's hitting it ever. Shooter 12 went first. I won't drag you through it. He was good, he was careful, and the wind ate him alive. He sent 3 rounds and the spotter called them all over the place, one left, one short, one he couldn't even find, just lost, gone, vanished into 2.5 miles of brown nothing. After the third, he sat up and pulled his earpro off and just sat there a while. Then he said, quiet, I can't read it. I can't read what I can't predict. And that was it for him. He was done. You could see it. Not just done shooting, done believing it was possible. That's a thing that happens to people, by the way. I watched it happen to several men out there over those 3 days. There's a moment where they stop trying to win and start trying to just not embarrass themselves. You can see it cross their face like a cloud. And once it's there, they're finished, even if they keep shooting. Shooter 13 was the last of the name guys. The one a few people had quietly figured was the best of the bunch. He'd been saving himself, I think, watching, waiting, letting everyone else burn their attempts. He had this calm about him that the others didn't. He'd done this kind of thing before. Big distances. Records even, supposedly. He took his time. Of course he did. And his spotter was sharp, kept feeding him corrections, the two of them murmuring back and forth in this clipped private language. The wind would gust and he'd come off the trigger. Settle, gust, off the trigger. He did that, I'm not exaggerating, for close to an hour, just waiting for one honest second from the air. And finally the flags all kind of agreed for a moment. They went slack and then leaned the same way, gentle together. The first time all morning the wind told the truth. And in that little window he fired. We counted. 8, 9, 10. And then it came. That sound. But not the bell again, not the bell, this scuffing, dusty crack from way out, and the spotter said, fast and tight, edge, that's an edge hit that caught the no, it clipped the post, clipped the stand. Round skipped off the upright. So close. So unbelievably, heartbreakingly close. The bullet had flown 2.5 miles through switching wind and arrived within inches of the plate. It had hit the metal post the plate was bolted to, kissed it and ricocheted off into the dirt. Inches, after all of that, inches. The shooter didn't say anything. He just lowered his head down onto his forearm there behind the rifle for a long moment. And the rest of us, God, I'll never forget the sound the crowd made. It wasn't a groan. It was this low collective exhale, almost a moan, the sound 30 people make when hope gets that close and then dies anyway. He took 2 more shots after that, but his heart was out of it, and the wind knew, and both went wide. He sat up. He shook his spotter's hand. He looked out at the plate one more time, gave this small, tired, respectful nod, and he said the line that everybody out there would repeat for the rest of the trip. It's not a target, it's a verdict. 13 attempts, 13 of the best. The closest miss was a couple inches of steel post. The chart on the side of the truck was a solid column of red, and it was almost noon and the wind was still tearing, and as far as anybody out there was concerned, it was over. The flats had won. The plate had held. People started packing up. For real. Coolers getting closed, tripods coming down. There was that flat, deflated feeling in the air, the way a party feels when everyone secretly decided to leave but nobody said it out loud yet. And then there was the SEAL. He was standing where he'd been standing the whole time, off to the side, hands in his pockets, looking out at the flats, and while everybody else was packing, he hadn't moved, hadn't touched a thing. He was just watching the wind. Same as he'd been doing for 3 days, with that same still patience, like a man waiting for a bus he's known all along would eventually come. One of the organizers, I think half as a joke, half because he just wanted the day to mean something, called over to him, said something like, "What about you, Chief? You came all this way. You want to turn before we lose the light." And the SEAL didn't answer right away. He kept looking at the flats, and I was close enough to see his eyes moving out across the range, flag to flag to flag, then up, like he was reading the sky above the plate, then back down. He stood like that for maybe 30 seconds, which is a long time when a crowd is half watching you, waiting. Then he said, real even, not loud at all. Not yet. Not yet, and he kept watching. People kind of shrugged and went back to packing. Whatever. Weird guy. Some folks rolled their eyes a little, if I'm honest. 13 of the best shooters on the planet had just been humbled into the dirt, and this quiet older man in a faded shirt was standing there saying not yet, like he was waiting for the universe to RSVP. But the old camp chair guy, the one who'd been calling it all along, he didn't roll his eyes. He sat up a little in his chair, and he watched the seal the same way the seal was watching the wind. And he said, quiet, just to me because I was near him. Watch this man. Don't watch the gun. Watch him. He's not waiting because he's scared. He's waiting because he's already done the math, and the math says the air isn't honest yet. And when it gets honest, just for a second, he's gonna know before any of these computers do. I didn't fully believe him, but I stopped packing. Here's the thing I learned watching that man wait. Everybody else had treated the wind like a problem to solve. They'd measure it, plug it into a computer, get a number, dial it in, and shoot. And the wind would change while the bullet was in the air and make their number a lie. They were always shooting at the wind that was, and by the time the bullet got there, that wind was gone. The seal wasn't doing that. I figured it out slowly watching him. He wasn't trying to measure the wind. He was trying to understand it. There's a difference, and it's the whole difference in the world. He was watching it long enough to learn its habits, the way it would gust and then take a breath, the way the flat dead spot near the target would hold for a few seconds after the near wind dropped. He was learning the rhythm of the thing. And he was waiting not for the wind to stop, because it never would, but for it to do, one more time, the predictable thing he'd watched it do 100 times over 3 days. He wasn't waiting for calm. He was waiting for a pattern he recognized. And here's the part that gives me chills even now. While he waited, he reached down, slow, no hurry at all, and he picked up a pinch of dry dirt between his fingers. And he let it go, watched it fall, watched which way it drifted, how fast, did it again. A pinch of dirt, while $30,000 of weather instruments sat 10 feet away. The ballistics guy saw him do it and kind of scoffed under his breath. Dirt, he muttered. We've got a kestrel reading to the 10th of a meter per second, and he's throwing dirt. The old man heard him, and the old man smiled this small, knowing smile and said, your machine tells you what the wind is doing right here, right now. His dirt tells him what the wind is about to do everywhere. There's a reason one of those things wins wars. The seal still hadn't picked up his rifle, and the day was getting on. The light was starting to slant, that late afternoon gold creeping in, and with it, this is the part the old man had been waiting for. With the cooling, the wind started to change its character. The hot, chaotic, switching wind of midday was beginning to settle into something cleaner. Late in the day, as the ground gives up its heat, the air calms in this particular way. The thermals die down. The mirage goes from a violent boil to a slow, lazy drift. The seal felt it before anybody said it. I watched him feel it. His chin came up just slightly. His eyes narrowed. He let one more pinch of dirt go, watched it fall almost straight down with just the faintest lean, and something in his face changed. Not excitement. Nothing as loud as that. More like recognition. Like he'd been waiting for an old friend and finally seen them come around the corner. He took his hands out of his pockets. And he said to nobody, to everybody, in that same flat, even voice, okay. Just that, okay. And he walked, unhurried, over to a long case that had been sitting closed and ignored by the trucks the entire time. The case nobody had paid attention to because the man it belonged to hadn't seemed in any rush to open it. People stopped packing. All of them. I want you to understand what the air felt like in that moment. 30 exhausted, defeated people who'd written the whole thing off 10 minutes ago, and every single one of them went still and turned to watch a quiet stranger crouch down and open a case in the slanting gold light. The old man in the chair set his coffee down on the ground beside him, real careful, like he didn't want to make a sound. "Here we go," he whispered. "Here we go." He opened the case the way some people open a Bible, no drama, just a kind of care that told you everything about the years behind it. I'd half expected something space age, some monster rifle covered in rails and dials and gadgets, the kind the younger competition guys had been running. It wasn't. His rifle was, I don't know how to put it, used. Honest. The finish worn pale on the spots where his hands went. A scope that wasn't the biggest one out there. No stickers, no flair. The whole thing looked like a tool that had been somewhere and didn't feel the need to talk about it. He didn't rush. That was the thing that struck everybody. 13 men had rushed in their own ways, even the patient ones had a kind of hunger in their hands. This man had none. He laid out his gear in an order that was clearly so worn into him he wasn't even thinking about it. Bipod. Bag under the stock. He thumbed a few rounds out of a little box and lined them up next to him in the dirt, neat, like soldiers at attention. And then, this is the part that made the back of my neck go cold. He didn't immediately get behind the gun. He sat down next to it first, cross-legged, in the dirt, and he just breathed, eyes half closed, for maybe a full minute. The wind moving over him, the gold light on the side of his face. A man getting quiet on the inside before he asked something hard of his own body. The old man whispered, "He's slowing his heart down. That's a heartbeat shot from here. The pulse in his own chest can throw it off at that range. He's getting his body still before he ever touches the trigger." A heartbeat. The man's own heartbeat could be the difference between a hit and a miss 2.5 miles away. So he was sitting in the dirt, slowing it down, like you gentle a nervous animal. He didn't have a spotter. I need to stop and tell you how strange that was, because at the time I didn't understand it, and once I did, it floored me. Every single one of the 13 had run a spotter. 2-man job. One behind the rifle, one behind a big spotting scope, the spotter calling wind, calling corrections, watching the trace of the bullet through the air and feeding it back. That's just how it's done at that level. It's not a one-man game. Nobody does it alone. He did it alone. When the organizer offered him a spotter, there were plenty of good ones standing around with nothing to do. He just shook his head. Once. Side to side. Didn't even say no out loud. And the organizer, to his credit, didn't push it. The old man, of course, had a theory. He always had a theory. He said, "A spotter's another voice, another opinion, another half-second of doubt between what he sees and what he does. This man doesn't want a translator between him and the air. He's done this enough times, and I'd bet money it wasn't on a range, that the gun is just part of his arm now. He's not gonna shoot the wind somebody tells him about. He's gonna shoot the wind he feels." I asked him, where do you think he learned it, if not on a range? And the old man got quiet, and he looked at the seal for a while, and then he said, "Places he can't talk about, to people who never came home to tell anybody he was there. That's why he doesn't say much. The quiet ones who can actually do it really do it. They're quiet for a reason. The talkers usually can't. He's not performing for us. Half of him probably wishes we'd all look away." He got down behind the rifle. And the whole desert changed. I don't know how else to say it. 30 people went silent in a way that felt almost physical, like the air pressure dropped. Even the wind seemed to lower its voice. The flags out on the range were doing that slow, settling late-day lean now, all of them more or less agreeing, the air finally telling something close to the truth. The mirage had gone from a boil to a slow, lazy crawl, drifting left, gentle, steady. He settled in behind the scope, and then he did the thing that took the longest. He waited some more. But this was a different kind of waiting than before. Before, he'd been learning the wind. Now he was inside the shot behind the glass, and he was waiting for the air to give him the exact repetition of the exact pattern he'd been studying for 3 days. He wasn't going to take the first decent window. He was going to take the right one. The honest one. The one he'd seen the wind hand out, again and again, in the cool of the late afternoon. I could hear his breathing. That's how quiet it was. Slow, so slow, long even breaths getting longer, getting slower until they almost seemed to stop. The flags leaned, held. The Mirage crawled left, smooth, no stutter. And he didn't fire. He let it pass. The first good window, he let it go. And I swear I heard somebody behind me make this tiny sound of disbelief, like what are you doing, because it had looked perfect, that window. It had looked like the cleanest air all day. But he let it pass. The old man breathed out slow. He didn't trust it, he murmured. Something in it he didn't like. He's waiting for the same one. The one he's seen the wind repeat. He wants the air to prove it's not lying by doing it twice. The wind gusted, switched. The flags scrambled. For maybe 40 seconds it was chaos again, and a couple people's shoulders sagged, like the moment had slipped away for good. And then it settled back. The flags leaned, the same lean. The Mirage crawled left, the same crawl. The same window come around again, exactly like he'd known it would, exactly like he'd been waiting 3 days to see twice in a row. His breathing stopped. Not dramatically. It just stopped. That pause at the bottom of an exhale, where everything in a person goes still, where the heartbeat is the only thing moving, and even that he'd slowed down to almost nothing. And in that perfect, terrible held-breath stillness, he fired. The shot wasn't even that loud. I'd braced for a boom. It was more of a hard, flat crack that slapped out across the flats and rolled away and got swallowed by all that open space. And then the rifle rocked back into his shoulder and went still, and he didn't move, didn't lift his head, didn't do anything except stay welded to that scope, watching, because the bullet was now somewhere out there in the air, climbing, arcing, falling, a tiny piece of copper crossing 2.5 miles of sky on the path he'd drawn for it in his head. And we counted. Nobody said the numbers out loud. We didn't have to. You could feel the whole crowd counting together, 30 hearts hammering out the same dreadful rhythm. 1, 2. The bullet was in the air. 3, 4. Still climbing, the highest point of its arc, way up over the desert, higher than you'd ever believe a rifle could throw something. 5, 6. Falling now, coming down, out there in the gold light, dropping toward a white plate the size of a kitchen table that 13 men had failed to touch. 7, 8. The old man had both hands gripping the arms of his camp chair. The ballistics guy had forgotten his meter entirely, was just staring out at the smudge with his mouth slightly open. 9. Almost there, almost, the longest second of my life. 10. And then, from somewhere out in the impossible distance, carried back faint and clean and unmistakable on the settling evening air. Tonk. The bell. The bell. Steel. A clear, ringing, perfect note of struck steel, traveling back across 2.5 miles of empty desert to reach 30 people who had completely forgotten how to breathe. He'd hit it. He'd hit it. For about 1 full second after that bell rang, nobody moved. I think we all needed that second just to believe it, to make sure the wind hadn't tricked us, hadn't carried back some other sound and dressed it up like what we wanted to hear. We all kind of looked at each other first, this round of wide eyes going person to person. Did you hear that? You heard that, right? That was steel, that was the plate, tell me that was the plate. And then the spotting scope guy, the one the SEAL had waved off. He was glued to a scope anyway out of pure habit, and he came up off it shouting, and his voice cracked right in half. Center plate, dead center, that's a hit, that's a clean center hit. And the desert came apart. I've never heard a sound like the one those 30 people made. It wasn't a cheer. A cheer is too clean a word for it. It was a roar, this raw explosion of 3 days of held breath and crushed hope and disbelief all bursting out at once. Grown men, serious, hard, been-everywhere men were screaming, jumping, grabbing each other. The young competition shooter who'd gone first, the cocky one, he had both hands locked on top of his head and he was just yelling at the sky. No, no, no way, no way. Over and over, laughing and shouting at the same time. The bearded Marine who'd come the closest the day before, the one who'd gone quiet after his miss, he was up out of his chair and he wasn't yelling. He had one hand over his mouth and his eyes were wet and he was just shaking his head slow, this look on his face like he'd witnessed something holy. He kept saying, quiet under all the noise, he read it. He read it. My God, he just read it. The old man in the camp chair didn't get up. He couldn't, I think. He just sat there and he had tears running straight down into his beard, not even trying to wipe them, and he was nodding and nodding and nodding, and he said, I could just barely hear it under the roar, there it is. There it is. That's what it looks like. I told you. I told you. It was chaos. Beautiful, deafening chaos. People were running toward the firing line. Somebody was already shouting that they had to drive out to the plate, they had to see it, get a photo, confirm the hit up close. Phones were out. The whole exhausted, defeated camp had detonated into pure joy in the space of about 4 seconds. And in the middle of all of it, the eye of the whole storm was the man who'd done it. And he hadn't moved. He was still down behind the rifle, still welded to that scope. While 30 people lost their minds around him, he hadn't so much as lifted his head. For a second I thought maybe he hadn't heard. Maybe he was so deep in concentration that the noise hadn't reached him. But that wasn't it. Slowly, and I mean slowly, the same unhurried pace he did everything, he came up off the scope. He pushed himself back from the rifle and sat up onto his knees in the dirt. And he looked out at the plate. Out at that tiny pale smudge 2.5 miles away that he'd just put a bullet through the center of after 13 better funded, better equipped, more celebrated men had failed. And his face didn't change. There was no grin, no fist in the air, no turning to the crowd, no looking around for the reaction, nothing. He just looked out at the target with this calm, level, almost sad expression. Like a man confirming something he'd always quietly known and had never particularly wanted to be the proof of. The cocky kid came running over, absolutely lit up, hand out for a high five, shouting, How? How did you do that, man? That was impossible. 13 guys, 13. How did you read that wind? And the SEAL looked at him, and there was kindness in it. He wasn't cold, I want to be clear. He wasn't a hard man. There was something gentle in how he looked at that excited kid. But he didn't have the answer the kid wanted. He just shook his head a little, this small, almost apologetic motion, and he said the only thing he said about the shot the whole evening. I didn't beat the wind. The kid blinked. What? I didn't beat it. He looked back out at the flats, at the flags doing their slow gold light lean. I just waited until it told the truth. Anybody could have made that shot. You just gotta be willing to be still long enough to be sure. Most people can't sit in the not knowing that long. That's all it is. That's all it is. And then he started quietly breaking his gear down, while the celebration roared on around him, while people clamored to shake his hand and clap his shoulder and ask him 100 questions. He thanked them, soft, polite, but he didn't drink it in. He didn't want it. He folded his bipod and he picked up his neat little line of soldier rounds and put them back in their box. And you got the very strong sense that the doing of the thing had been the entire point, and that the noise afterward was, to him, a little bit beside it, almost something to be endured. The old man in the chair finally got himself up. Took him a while. His knees weren't what they used to be. And he made his way over to the SEAL, slow, leaning on a walking stick I hadn't even noticed he had. And the crowd kind of parted for him without quite knowing why. He stood in front of the SEAL, 2 old men in a sense, though one was a good bit older than the other. And the SEAL stopped packing and stood up to face him, out of respect, you could tell. Something passed between them, some recognition. Like they were members of the same quiet club and both knew it without anybody saying so. The old man stuck out his hand, the SEAL shook it. And the old man said, not loud, but clear enough that those of us nearby heard it. Where'd you carry that patient's home from, son? And for the first time in 3 days, something flickered behind the SEAL's eyes, just a flicker, there and gone, and he said real low, "Places where being patient was the only thing that brought you home at all." And the old man nodded slow, like that was exactly the answer he'd known he'd get. He held onto the SEAL's hand a second longer than a handshake, and he said, "Thank you, not for the shot, for showing these kids what it actually costs." And the SEAL, I watched his jaw work just once, this tiny tightening. He nodded back. Didn't say anything. Couldn't, maybe, and he went back to packing his gear. A few guys did drive out to the plate. Took a good 15 minutes to get there across the flats, dust kicking up behind the truck the whole way until it was just a little speck out near the target. And we waited, all of us, watching that speck, and then a radio crackled and one of them came back on, and his voice was full of something close to awe. "Confirmed, confirmed, center hit. It's guys, it's dead center. Couple inches off true center maybe, after 4,000 meters, dead center. Dead center. After everything. After 13 attempts in 3 days and the closest anybody else got being a foot and a half low or a chip of a steel post. This one quiet man, on the very last light of the very last day, on his very first and only shot, put it through the middle. His only shot, I keep coming back to that. He didn't fire a string of rounds and find it. He didn't walk it in. He waited 3 days, took one shot and hit, and then he packed up. When the truck got back and they showed him the photo on a phone, the bright dimple of the strike right there in the heart of the plate, he looked at it for about 2 seconds. He nodded. He said, "Good." And he handed the phone back. Good, that was it, good. The sun was going down for real now. The light had gone from gold to deep orange to that purple blue the desert turns right before dark. People were finally, actually packing up to leave, but the feeling was the complete opposite of the one we'd had a couple hours earlier. We weren't leaving defeated. We were leaving like people who'd been to church. Quiet, but full. Changed in some way none of us could have explained to anybody who hadn't been there. And the SEAL slung his case over his shoulder, and he walked off toward the trucks, alone, the way he'd come. A faded shirt and a worn ball cap, and a beard going gray, and the most ordinary-looking man you ever saw, who just done the single most extraordinary thing any of us had ever witnessed, and who clearly, genuinely, did not need a single one of us to know it. I think that's the part that haunts me most. He didn't need us to know. We sat around the fire that last night longer than we needed to. Nobody wanted to leave, really. There was this unspoken thing, like if we all went to sleep, the day would be over for good, and we'd have to carry it back into the regular world where things like that don't happen and people wouldn't believe us if we told them. So we stayed up. We fed the fire. We talked. And mostly we talked about him. The SEAL. He'd gone to his truck and turned in early, of course he had, so it was just us, picking over what we'd seen, trying to make sense of it. The young guy, the cocky kid who'd gone first 3 days and a lifetime ago, he wasn't cocky anymore. He sat staring into the fire and he said, "I've been shooting my whole life. I've got the best gear money can buy. I trained for this. And I missed by 15 meters. And that guy showed up in a shirt that's older than I am, threw dirt in the air, didn't even use a spotter, took one shot and put it dead center." He shook his head. "I don't even know what to do with that." The bearded Marine, the one who'd come the closest the day before and gone so quiet after, he was the one who answered. And what he said is the thing I've never forgotten. He said, "You're looking at it wrong. You think he beat you with skill. He didn't. Your skill was probably better than his, pound for pound. He beat you with patience. And patience isn't a skill you train at a range. It's a thing the world has to teach you the hard way. You learn that kind of stillness in places where moving too soon gets you killed. Where being wrong about the wind isn't a missed shot, it's somebody's son who doesn't come home." He poked at the fire. "We came out here to win a game. That man's been somewhere the game was real. That's the whole difference. That's everything." Nobody said much after that. The fire popped. The desert was huge and black and cold around us, full of stars like I've only ever seen out there, away from everything. The old man, the camp chair philosopher who'd called the whole thing before it happened, he was the last one up with me. Everybody else had drifted off to their tents and trucks, and he sat there with his coffee gone cold in his hands, looking into the coals. And I asked him, I've been wanting to ask all night. I said, you knew, the whole time you knew he'd do it, how? And he was quiet for a while, then he said, I didn't know he'd hit it, nobody could know that. The flats might have lied to him too, but I knew he was the only one out there who understood what he was actually fighting. He took a slow sip of cold coffee, made a face, set it down. All these young fellas, they thought the enemy was the distance, 4,000 meters. The drop, the drift, the math, so they fought the math. And the math is huge and it's cruel and it'll grind a man down. But that old boy, he said, and he nodded toward the dark where the trucks were, where the SEAL was sleeping, he knew the distance was never the enemy. The distance just sits there. It doesn't change. You can solve the distance with a notebook. No, the real enemy was time. Those 9-10 seconds the bullets in the air. The enemy was everything that could change while you waited. And you can't solve time with a notebook. You can only outwait it. You have to be willing to sit in the not knowing, not for an hour, not for a day, for as long as it takes the world to show you the truth twice. And then you have to trust it completely, with your whole body, in the space of one held breath. He looked at me. Most men can't do that, it's not in them. They get to the edge of the not knowing and it scares them and they pull the trigger just to make the waiting stop. That's why 13 of them missed, not because they were bad, because they couldn't stand it. He smiled, sad and small. He could stand it. He'd stood worse in worse places with more on the line than a steel plate, and the rest was just letting his hands do the easy part. I left the next morning before he did. I went over to say goodbye. He was leaning against his truck, coffee in hand, watching the sun come up over the flats, those same flats, going gold again, the place that had broken 13 men and finally told one of them the truth. And I didn't really know what to say to him. Thank you felt too small. That was amazing felt like an insult somehow, like it would cheapen it. So I just said, why'd you come out here? If you didn't care about the record, about any of it, why drive 4 hours into nowhere just to take one shot? And he thought about it. He actually thought about it, like nobody had asked him before, or maybe like he'd never asked himself. And then he said, looking out at the flats, not at me, I'm getting old, the hands aren't what they were, the eyes either. He turned the coffee cup slowly in his fingers. I wanted to know if the quiet was still in there, the thing that mattered, not the shooting anybody can shoot, the other thing, the being still thing. I wanted to see if I still had it before it goes. He took a sip. Turns out I do, for a little while longer, that's all I came to find out. He nodded at me, friendly, final, and he got in his truck. And he drove off across the flats, the dust rising up gold behind him in the new morning light, the most ordinary man in the most ordinary truck, getting smaller and smaller until he was just a speck out near where the target had been, where the impossible had happened, and then he was gone. I think about him a lot, more than I'd expect to, about a man whose name I never even got. Because we live in a loud world. Everybody's shouting that they're the best, everybody's got the gear and the highlight reel and the thing to sell. And I watched 13 of the loudest, most decorated, best-equipped men on earth walk up to a wall, one after another, and fail. And then I watched a silent man in a faded shirt walk up to that same wall, throw a pinch of dirt in the air, wait 3 days for the world to stop lying, take one breath, and pass straight through it, and then walk away before anybody could even shake his hand properly. He didn't beat the distance. He just understood, better than any of us, that some things in this life can't be conquered or rushed or shouted down. Some things you can only outwait. You sit in the dark and the doubt and the not knowing, longer than anybody else is willing to, until the truth finally shows itself. And then, in the one quiet second it gives you, you have to be ready. The loudest men in the desert spent 3 days fighting the wind. The quietest one just waited for it to tell the truth. And that, I think, is the whole story of how to do anything that actually matters.